Yeah. Immortal technique. El DJ Green Lantern.
So let's start with the whole debate about well, at the peak of the crisis, many people were announcing the end of neoliberalism, the end of neoliberalization, and we had and we witnessed even many mea culpas. Like there were many people whom you wouldn't expect to be in a position to question their own framework of thinking, their own policies. In Enigma of Capital, you mentioned Elizabeth II's visit to LSE,
yes,
and then
yes.
the response, and where they have to acknowledge that they somehow managed to forget to take account of systemic risk.
Yes.
And then people like William Buiter, I think that from Financial Times, he also said that neoclassical economics in its current form has been decades and decades of waste of resources and talent. And so we had that at the peak, and many people were talking about the return of Keynes and all that. And while the bailouts lasted of the financial sector, once that was over, it seems that, and already at the G20 meeting in Toronto, they officially announced an age of austerity.
Yeah.
And even a member of Cameron's government went so far to explicitly state that this is a unique opportunity even to redefine the horizon of expectations. Yes. So it seems not only is neoliberalization not dead, but it's back with a vengeance. So
yes,
I
call this period the end game, the vicious end game of neoliberalization. I mean, it's just taking it one step further. It's been a 30-year game, and the one thing that I always want to insist upon is to see it as a class project. And you know, a lot of people see it as a sort of technical or ideological kind of thing. I kind of say no. They change the ideology when they need to, and they change the technical meanings when they need to. They needed to change the technical meanings when the financial crisis was at its height. So all the neoliberals went Keynesian very briefly, but by the time you rescued the financial institutions, then you kind of immediately reverted to the neoliberal orthodoxy, and then came up with you know, the monetarist sort of austerity is the answer kind of mantra. So it's again, it's a strategic shift and drumming up this fear of the deficit and fear of the debt and the necessity of austerity is a way to go after all of the social programs, to go after environmental regulation, and all the things that big capital doesn't like. So it's like I say, it's a tactical, there's a little tactical shift in the middle there. Because they needed the bailout money to get out of the mess, and then they did that, and then they switched back immediately to the deficit hawkishness.
So, and this is something that you have drawn a very clear, in your book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, you've drawn a very clear analytical distinction between neoliberalism as ideology,
yes,
and the really existing neoliberalism,
yes,
as
yes,
a process of neoliberalization.
Right.
And these, as you said now, the tactical and strategic opportunism.
Right.
And it seems that much of the left and even neoliberals seem to be drawn into the game of discussing neoliberalism in its utopian ideological form,
yes, right,
and thereby missing the undercurrent,
yes,
being restoration of class power, as
yes,
you see.
right.
So would you say that now, as you say, end game in the sense of a deepening of the project of restoration of class power, and even in relatively privileged zones like Western Europe and Northern America and so forth and so forth. And the irony being that Keynesianism now, and you have written about it very early on, you said that the chances for a real, under Obama, a real Keynesian turn are very thin.
Yes.
But the China seems to be the only player who has both the economic capacities because of the currency reserves and the political means because of the relative autonomy of the Chinese Communist Party with regard to capital. And so, and that is playing out in that direction.
Yeah.
But how do you see, what do you see as the points of possible intervention for the left in this context, the left for one of the West?
Yeah.
So are we still? I mean, are we in the position that we still need to defend the welfare state? Obviously, we are. But
well, I think by the way, one of the things that advantages the Chinese have is they're not ideologically afraid of being called communist or socialist. Because in the United States, Obama does something very mild and is immediately accused of being a damnable kind of communist socialist. So the ideological configuration, I guess what Althusser called the ideological state apparatus is operating full time, particularly in countries like the United States. But it's interesting also what you said about the left. I mean, there were a lot of accounts of neoliberalism and neoliberalization coming out in the 2000s. But I think mine was not perhaps unique, but one of the things I noticed about many of them is that they actually forgot the class dimension. It was about technical and ideological kind of configurations, and it was not seen as a class project. And one of the things that I really tried to do was to insist it be seen as a class project, with therefore, and from that perspective, you could then understand why there were all these kind of tactical kind of shifts, like Keynesian militarism under Reagan, another form of Keynesian militarism under Bush Jr., which is completely wrong according to neoliberal precepts, So, but on the other hand, nobody objected. So I thought it was very important to keep that class dimension very much in mind, and what we see is the capitalist class has come through the crisis pretty well. I mean, some of them got hurt, but most of them are as rich as they've ever been, and some of them have been richer than they've ever been. The leading hedge fund managers just the year before last got $3 billion in personal remuneration each in a single year, which is the highest it's ever been. And actually profit rates in the United States are as high as they've ever been. So the capitalist class has been doing very well through the middle of a crisis. And in fact, for them, it is an opportunity to consolidate even further their power and to drive down the standards of living of the rest of the population. So if there is a class strategy in the United States right now, I think it's pretty clear that it's about driving down the living standards of the working class to the point where the United States can be more competitive in global markets because it's going to be a low-wage economy. And to the degree that it can use illegal immigrants and all those kinds of things to do it, there's all this fuss about illegal immigrants, but on the other hand, they play a very, very crucial role as part of this strategy. Now, if you see it in that way, as strategic, then you kind of say, on the left, if we see it clearly in that way, and we clearly see that class war is being waged, as Warren Buffett likes to say, and it's being waged by them and they're winning, then we have to say, well, the only answer to this is to wage class war back. But, again, in the United States, the ideological state apparatus works in such a way as to say, well, if you mention class war, that's divisive, and it's against the national interest, and it's all those kinds of things. So, there is a battle to be fought in the realm of ideology to say this is about class war. And of course, that's one of the things that the mainstream media will not tolerate. So I can't get on the mainstream media ever to say, well, actually, we're in a position of class war. I mean, Warren Buffett can do it, and they say it in a humorous kind of way, and everybody smiles. I mean, so this is our situation. But the left, I think, hasn't really articulated the class war aspect of this, partly because much of the left is caught up with, I don't know, philosophical argumentation about, you know, the nature of communism and so on, which I think is fine, you know, I'm not objecting to it, but it doesn't actually address the political situation very, very clearly. And doesn't organize around that because in many instances there is this divisiveness that comes out of the continued adherence to some form of identity politics and the way identity politics gets involved. And so that mass movements that actually have the capacity to be about a class often get divided immediately. For example, in 2006, there was this huge immigrants' rights movement in the United States. You know, 300,000 people out on the streets of Los Angeles. I mean, it was huge. And one of the great things about it was when all the immigrants stopped working, the cities stopped running. And it was clear that actually cities ran on the basis of an immigrant workforce. This clearly was a very empowering kind of moment. Now, at that moment, all of the right-wing commentators on the news suddenly discovered the poor African Americans. They'd never mentioned them before. They expressed great sympathy with the fact that these immigrants were taking away jobs from African Americans. And so at that point they started to try to divide the potential class movement by turning African American populations against the immigrant populations. And of course, some incidents occurred, and after about 6 months, the class character of that started to dissolve into interethnic Hispanic immigrants versus, you know, but all of these, you know, right-wing white commentators who never had expressed any sympathy for African Americans in their whole political life suddenly decided the African Americans are great people and we should be supporting them and their struggles and these immigrants taking away their jobs. So this is the way in which politics kind of works. And again, I think the left sometimes is naive in not expecting that, because historically this has always gone on. And there should have been a clear, there should have been clear understanding at the very outset that this was likely to happen. And there should have been a preparatory work with the African American population, African American leaders saying, watch out, they're going to say this sort of stuff to you, and you realize it's part of this class. But again, class politics is not something that's easy to construct in many parts of the world because it's divided and ruled in the way, all these different ways.
What you just, maybe to follow up on the predicaments of the left today, and the reluctance to use class as a concept, as an analytical concept, and as a politically empowering concept, seems in parts, well, an indication of the ideological hegemony of the right, as you said. Right. Because class struggle does not start when workers start fighting back. That's basically, it's always already there. You know? Yes. And Warren Buffett has no problems admitting it. Right. But the left seems traumatized, traumatized in that sense that once you mention class politics from a left position, you're automatically outside of what is what is permitted ideologically. So and maybe even at a deeper level, it seems to me, and I don't know whether you agree, but as you mentioned. Certain tendencies of the left today. It seems to me almost that there are two branches, let's say two tendencies strong that can be reduced maybe to the same fundamental historical trauma. And let's go, the trauma of really existing socialism, the trauma of the Leninist party, and the right-wing narratives that have simply to great extent even very aggressively revisionist. Yes. Let's say even the Soviet Union's role in World War II is in American movies. I mean, you would you only see GIs and white GIs at that, and so on and so on. So it seems that the left has basically accepted that it has to take by any means under all circumstances to have to distance itself from the Leninist party, from organizational structures, from any ambition to use the state as a battlefield, like as a means that could be taken over and bent to left purposes. And so, what we have today the one thing you already mentioned. It's a very abstract, philosophical, revolutionary, almost a form of mysticism, and you know, about the event and the authentic act, and often with explicit reference to theological motives. And on the other hand, you have the so-called movement of movements, which is also basically keeps a very an emphasis on keeping a distance from old organizational forms.
Yeah.
And within that framework.
Well, I think we're in a transitional moment. I find, you know, it's very hard for me to kind of give any kind of global thing, but I have to say that, for example, the neoliberalism book has traveled a lot around the world, and I meet a lot of people in social movements and so on who've read it and clearly get it, you know. The Marx classes which I offer online are, you know, being picked up all around the world, and you know, so I think that there's more openness right now to the development of a class perspective, and it's an openness that exists which is beyond the Socialist Workers' Party and the various groups on the left that maintain that kind of position, and so but I think that openness partly comes from a recognition that there is a form of class politics that doesn't necessarily commit you to a Leninist party, or doesn't necessarily commit you to, you know, some allegiance to what happened in the Soviet Union or what happened in actually existing socialism in Central Europe and all the rest of it. So I think that there's enough daylight, if you like, now between the collapse of the Soviet Union and where we are now that maybe some of that sort of hangover from the collapse of the Soviet project and the general kind of, you know, rejection of that kind of world. I think there's more openness now on the part of greater chunks of the population. That would be my feeling anyway. And as a result of that, it seems to me that there are more people from within those social movements. There are more people now who are interested in thinking about their social movement in relationship to a broader anti-capitalist project. So that when you start to talk about an anti-capitalist project, people are much more likely, I think, to rally to the cause of that now than even maybe 5 years ago, because, you know, one of the effects of the crisis was some people who had been persuaded by all these people you're talking about who kind of preached all this stuff didn't believe that gospel anymore, and have actually therefore been prepared to take a rather different, you know, look at things. But this is a slow process. I mean, you're trying to, and it's one in which there's tremendous kind of resistance in the mainstream media. I mean, I was just talking to Terry Eagleton today, and I kind of said, you know, we're in a situation where the more plausible Marx gets, the more you're likely to bring down real heavy, violent criticism from mainstream, because they see it's dangerous now. In the past, they tended to see it, you know, people were playing in a sandbox somewhere and nobody was taking them seriously. But I think they're now very fearful about the fact that we are being taken more seriously. And I personally feel I'm being taken much more seriously now than I was 5 years ago, and certainly much more seriously now than I was 10 or 15 years ago, where, you know, I was playing in a sandbox, an equivalent. So it's changing, but it's changing slowly. And as I think you know, ideological shifts take some time to work through, and I think we're beginning to see some of that. And I think the analogy of the 1930s was you had the crash in 1929. Things only really started to move politically in the 1933s, and it was, you know, in the United States, by the time you get to 1939, you're really, you know, things are really kind of beginning to consolidate. So maybe we're in a slow phase, particularly to the degree that capitalism cannot satisfy the needs of the majority of the world's population. And inside of the United States, where people are used to it satisfying their needs, the fact that they're going to have to lose much of their standard of living over the next 10 or 15 years is going to create, I think, a climate of either vicious scapegoating of immigrants and all the rest of it, so it can go right-wing, but I think also it can go left-wing. So that's part of the struggle we're in right now, is to change people's consciousness and open up possibilities.
But if we take the comparison with the 30s, and then, as you said already, in large parts of Europe, the right-wing backlash, right-wing reaction, fascism won, in a situation where the left was much more organized than it is today. Social democratic parties that actually were social democratic in their social and political agendas, unions, communist parties all over Europe, especially Germany, and we knew how that ended. So and Capital there saw that basically it was forced to shed its liberal democratic guise, and it turned very violently authoritarian. And even in Europe today, if you look at countries like Finland or the Netherlands, which are historically considered to be very liberal and even social democratic or all that, we have now right-wing parties entering parliament, not to speak of Hungary and so on. So not to sound fatalistic, but it seems that this is really, if you say end game, this could really be, it's almost like we were living until 5 or 10 years ago. People like Zizek enjoyed, playing the Hitler card and comparing things to fascism, but it didn't seem historically viable that we could see something like this again. But even and for example, just countries like Germany with the Greek crisis, the way the mainstream media covered the crisis, in a country which for 50 years is having a program is traumatized with its history, and in the media it was very important to be politically correct and all that. We had an immediate resurrection of very explicitly racist theories of mentality, the lazy Greeks, the Mediterraneans, the parasites, the German workers working. And so it seems that the readiness of the elites and the media to take the right wing, the right turn, the authoritarian turn. And if you look at the United States and similar things, is very very real and very frightening in that sense. And
well, I don't discount the possibility that it could go off in that direction at all. I doubt, for a variety of reasons, that it will go off in the same way as it did, say, in the 1930s. I think it's likely to become more authoritarian. And there are think tanks in the United States now that are saying things like, the problem is that democracy doesn't work, and we have to create an alternative kind of economic administration. And they always put this in rather paternalistic, benevolent terms, that an elite will govern and make the decisions, and it won't be subject to democratic pressures, and it will make decisions on behalf of the well-being of the whole people, so it's that kind of thing. And I wouldn't be at all surprised to see institutions emerging that are more authoritarian. But authoritarian versus the sort of fascist, I know what the rise of racism and so on, but I think actually, given the way in which the world's economy is structured now, racism may be a local card that gets played, but internationally, if you start to imagine that somehow or other, white people can superimpose their will upon the mass of world's population, forget it. You're not going to be able to do it. So I don't think that a sort of a global fascism is likely to. I think that's very unlikely. But I do see an increasing authoritarianism and dictatorial powers being assumed. But and in fact, right now, if you look at the dictatorial powers of the world's central banks, well, you know, we live under the dictatorship of the world's central banks in lots of ways. So there already is a ruling elite that is making decisions which we don't have any democratic control over. So, and I think what's going on right now is a kind of a shallow form of democracy in which we have democracy over, you know, shall we have a local park or shan't we kind of thing, but real democracy at the main levels of capitalist organization, and the answer is no, already. But I think it will be more explicitly recognized, and at some point somebody will say, well, forget the sham. And I think we're beginning to see that language emerging. Forget the sham about democracy. Central banks are going to have to decide. They're going to have to decide it's an emergency. Bang, bang, bang. You know, we do this, and we do that, and that's it. And there's an increasing tendency to use the state as an authoritarian kind of apparatus.
Maybe and now to go back to a related question, but it has to do with the status of, let's say, the central bank in the European Central Bank.
Yes.
And the specific paradoxes within the European Union, where you have a monetary union without fiscal union.
Yes.
And even right-wing people like Helmut Kohl, in his time, he said, well, we know that once we have a common currency, that this will hopefully force us all to adjust politically, and
yes.
and that means also fiscally. But what we see now, the surplus countries like Germany are not agreeing to redistribute part of the surpluses internally within the European Union, and it seems. So it seems a fundamentally paradoxical, even from capitalist perspective. If the European Union as a project, which is a project which is supposed to be a strong player globally in global competition, it needs to function as a unified economic space. But that comes with certain obligations, which the elites seem not really politically ready to act on. So that brings me to the question generally of maybe certain paradoxes of the neoliberal state. Maybe in the 70s, Marxists had big discussions about the role of the state.
Yep.
It was the problem of the welfare state made things more complicated. Before that, it seemed very clear. You know, we know the bourgeois state, the capitalist state acts as in the interest of capital, full stop. Yeah. And then the welfare state seemed to complicate things a bit. So the left, Marxists had to theoretically face the problem. Of the class compromise of the Keynesian or the welfare state, and so on and so on. But now, in retrospect, it seems that the Keynesian state seems to have really acted more in accordance with the classical Marxist formula, like the executive committee of capital in general.
Class, yeah.
Yes, the capitalist class as a whole.
Yeah.
So to take care of the long-term interests, and Keynes explicitly said he wanted to save capitalism from its own destructive consequences, the free, you know, the contradictions of the free market, social and political. But the neoliberal state, in that sense, seems from that perspective to be the agent of a certain fraction of capital,
yes.
finance capital.
Yes.
Which seems to have sucked in even the logic of the state, the policy logics of the state, into its own temporality,
yeah.
short-term profits,
yeah.
which produce, it seems even from the so it seems like the state does not any longer function as a rational agent of capital as a whole, And there, I don't know if I'm really clear, but there seems to be a contradiction. The neoliberal state seems more obviously an instrument of capital, but at the same time, it's like Marx said, it very emphatically destroys the resources it depends on, the environment and the workers.
Yeah. Well, I think, to me, you know, one of the things that Marx, I think, pointed out, and I take very seriously, I mean, he argues that the financial system, the credit system, operates as the common capital of the class. And therefore, class politics and class interests are as much worked out via the financial system as they are by the state. But when you look more closely at the financial system cannot operate without actually merging with a part of the state apparatus, and this is what I call the state-finance nexus, because somebody has to regulate money supply. So what you see is the formation of very close alliance. I mean, for instance, in the United States, we have the Federal Reserve, which is the pinnacle of the financial system, and the US Treasury, which is that part of the state which is concerned with, you know, the monetary aspects. And when the big crisis struck, it was very interesting. The only two people who came on television and told us what was going to happen were Ben Bernanke and John Paulson, i.e. the Secretary of the Treasury and the head of the Federal Reserve. And that was the state-finance nexus in motion. Now, what has happened, I think, is that that part of the state which is involved in this kind of way has always been separate from, you know, the welfare state and education departments and even from defense departments. And there are all these stories about cabinet meetings in Britain where, you know, somebody comes up with a great plan to do this and this and this, and the Treasury Secretary sits there and at some point or other says, no, you can't do it. If you don't have the money, stop it. So there's a kind of complicated relationship within the state apparatus. So that part of the state, which is acting in the common capital, as the common capital of the class, which is the financial system and the state. So, in effect, the neoliberal revolution never touched that nexus. In fact, it emphasized the power of that nexus. And this is what sometimes people started to call the Washington consensus is really the US Treasury Wall Street consensus. And they started to talk about the Washington Wall Street kind of thing. So that became very much more explicit under neoliberalization, very explicit. Whereas the rest of the state apparatus is operating in ways we know about, you know, well, we want to reduce expenditures on social reproduction, we want to cut out all this environmental stuff, and, you know, so the state is not a unified entity, and I think that you have to segregate that part which does operate in this way. Now, what we saw in the middle of the crisis was they suddenly became visible as to who they were, the people who were really making the decisions about this stuff. They've now kind of retreated into their shells, and so they're less visible. They're still somewhat visible, but they're not anywhere near as kind of, you know, out front as they were during that crisis period. But they are, if you like, being reinforced, and of course internationally, who meets at the G20? Well, okay, the presidents do, but who goes along with the presidents? Well, it's usually the central bankers and the Treasury Department that goes along, and they talk. And I gather that every morning the Treasury Secretaries of all of the major powers have a kind of collective phone call, kind of, okay, what's going on? Are there any fires that need to be put out here? So there is a global coordination between them, which doesn't exist in the other parts of the state apparatus. So I think that we are living under, when I say we're living under the dictatorship of the world central banks, we're really existing under the dictatorship of this state finance nexus, which is embedded in nation states, but it also has this international dimension because it's also the IMF and the World Bank which are involved in all of this too. So, and sometimes elements of the WTO. So there's an emergent managerial committee of bourgeois interest.
Okay. But you know now, but exactly this. If the financial, let's say, if the central bankers and if the financial sector, generally the big banks, I mean, we know that Paulson and all the other basically people who are in the who are part of the administration. I mean, the revolving door policy. It's a known fact.
Yes,
that it's
Goldman Sachs. We call government Sachs.
Yes. So the question is, are they really capable to play the role of the interest of capital as a whole? Because it seems that they are not in many regards that they are not. I mean that the Volcker shock and the monetarist turn deliberately produced. I mean, you've written about it. Has produced a recession. That recession, I mean, also hit large sections of productive capital. It deindustrialized the United States. At the same time, it led to the suppression of wage demands of workers, led to an unsustainable rise of debt as we see now. I mean, the crisis was basically a manifestation of unsustainable amounts of debt in the mortgage market and so on. So it seems that it becomes ever more evident or clear that they can't really manage capitalism.
Well, you know, I mean, if they're in a position of management, it doesn't always mean that they manage it in a wise way. And I think there's no question that to some degree they were living in a world in which a false theory was essentially being followed and false policies were being routinely applied. In other words, they didn't necessarily think through the long-term consequences of their actions. Furthermore, I don't think they were necessarily interested in benefiting capital in general. They were interested in benefiting a certain definition of the capitalist class. And that definition of the capitalist class, there's no question about it, was increasingly the financial sector. In other words, that is what they were mainly concerned with. And that is why people like Paulson and Rubin went in and became Treasury Secretary, because this was a way of making sure the state finance nexus was oriented in such a way to support their faction of the capitalist class, not necessarily supporting the producers. So I think that whether or not they come up with policies which are supporting capital in general seems to me to be a rather contingent question. And to the degree that they believed, and I suspect that some of them really did believe in the sort of pure, perfectly functioning market hypothesis, and Greenspan certainly, I think, was a believer of Ayn Rand and a follower of Ayn Rand and really believed that stuff. So it wasn't pure opportunism, it was kind of deeply felt kind of belief. So to the degree that people who got into controlling the state finance nexus accepted a kind of neoliberal theory as being gospel, they made decisions alongside of that, but at the same time they were making decisions which were clearly related to the interests of a certain faction of capital, not necessarily for capital even capital in general, let alone the whole of capitalist society.
So we have to end it here.
Yes, right. Okay.
Thanks. There were many other things, but
yes, okay. Well, this is the way it goes.
But thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you.
Okay. But maybe I wasn't very clear, so this is now not part of the interview.
Well, until they rush us out, you can speak.
No, if they say that we have to go. But what I wanted to say, I mean, I wasn't really clear, but I wanted to hear your opinion, that it seems almost like, the Keynesian state was because of the big Depression and everything, the Great Depression, was the point where capital realized, okay, we have to take a step back and organize things for the long-term benefit of ourselves as a class. Partly due to the Cold War, of course, because of fears that they were, that the Great Depression would be back once the war was over.
Yes. Yeah.
So there was a certain awareness of the systemic danger, which the system itself produces. So they knew that they were, they knew that they were riding a dangerous beast to their own benefits, but that they had to. And the whole debates about the Marshall Plan and whether there were fractions of capital who wanted immediately to go in there and take the markets over.
Right.
But there was a political awareness that no, we have to take a step back and allow these economies to work.
There are factions of capital that think that way now. I mean, people like George Soros and so on. I mean, Soros says basically, regulate me or I'll make a killing. And they don't regulate him and he makes a killing. And he says, I told you I was going to do it.
Buffett says the same.
Buffett says the same thing. So there are people like that who kind of say, look, this is an insane system here, and you should change it because it's obviously going to create. But meanwhile, I am certainly not going to change my business practices out of any moral scruples. I'm, all the time I can make megabucks out of this system and you're letting me do it, I'm going to do it. So, it's very interesting the way in which...
but that seems...
so there are factions, and they're completely different from, say, the Koch brothers, who are kind of rabid right-wing ideologues, and who are funding the Tea Party and all that kind of thing. So the capitalist class is pretty divided about, all of that stuff.
Yeah, but that seems the great paradox. The neoliberal state is so obviously an instrument of capital, but at the same time a very self-destructive instrument, much more than the Keynesian state, who seem to be not so clearly, not on the immediately. It seemed.
And the neoliberal state hasn't done a good job of promoting growth, hasn't done a good job of anything. All it's done is a fantastically good job of redistributing assets to the rich. I mean, it's done a fantastic job as a class project. So why would the class that created that want to change it when it's done such a fantastic job for them? Which is why I say we're in the end game of it rather than,